Hey, what's up? I'm Paige, or Novice Cosplay, and in this video I'm going to show you the entire process of how I made my Emerald Sustrai cosplay from RWBY. I'm going to show you almost everything in a step-by-step guide, except for the vest and the top, because when I first started making this cosplay I wasn't filming, but I am going to show you how I made this loop for the C-ring. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the vest right now, just kind of going through it a little bit. So for the vest, it's pretty basic. After I had my pattern drafted, I just sewed those pieces together on the side seams. I added bias tape all around the edges. Right here in the center, I used elastic and sewed on buttons on either side. Now for the crisscross part, I just created a separate long rectangle, added the cross, and then sewed it to the rest of the vest. And you can't see it really well because I kind of attached it so it would lay flat, but you'll be able to figure it out, I think. And then for the back emblem, it's just iron-on vinyl that I cut out with scissors. The vest is pretty easy once you have the pattern, so I'm sure you can do it without any steps. All right, with that out of the way, let's dive into the rest of the costume. If you only need to see how to do a certain part, there are timestamps below and you can skip to that. Please excuse any mismatched or weird or just low quality footage. My future videos will have better footage. I filmed this cosplay over the course of 2 years, 3 moves, and probably with about 3 different cameras. So just bear with me. And if it's too bad, then you can just skip it. All right, thanks. Let's get started.
All right, first I'm going to walk you through the steps of making the leg coverings, assless chaps, whatever you want to call them. These were the most involved portion of the costume, and if you are going to make these out of pleather, make sure you just look up a few tips and tricks for sewing with pleather. Also, be careful not to sew through more layers than your machine can handle.
Okay, so this is the back piece of my pattern, and the front piece is basically just a slanted rectangle, that little opening in the front for the little knee pad. So the main thing you want to keep in mind is adding enough slits. That way you can turn the pleather over and stitch that down, which will create a nice finished edge instead of a raw edge. So once you trace out the shape that you want on the back, you basically just add a little bit of seam allowance back and then add these slits at every point. You cut a triangle out at any points that point outwards instead of inwards, like this. And then on these curves, you also need to just do a few slits along the way to help facilitate that curve. If it's straight, you don't need to add any slits because it'll just fold really easily like that. But yeah, this gives you an idea of the pattern and what it will look like.
Once you have your pattern ready and mock-ups done, cut out your pattern, making sure to mark and cut all of the slits. I recommend tracing your pattern with a pen to avoid pinning it and pinholes. After that, I sewed the windows, folding them open, then top stitching. Next, I sewed the side seams of the leg openings. The final step for putting them together is top stitching the seams, which will help the seam lay flat and it'll look really nice. For the windows or openings where the white fabric shows, I ended up attaching white fabric behind them. I simply used Scotch tape to hold the fabric in place and then top stitched over the existing stitches from before, which creates depth and makes it look like it's a separate layer. After that, I closed up the pant leg, sewing the last side seam closed. Next up are some details like the straps and knee pad. First, I patterned the straps just with some paper. There are a few different ways for how you can make the points on your straps, which you can see here. And the pants needed a lot of straps, so I just cut them all out at once to save time. After that, all that's left is pinning them and top stitching around the edges. Before sewing them on, I also made the knee pad. The knee pad is very oddly shaped, so it required a lot of slits to lie flat. But I just pinned those down and then top stitched around the edge. Then, to attach it to the pants, you can either sew it on or glue it on. I opted for a mix of E6000 glue and sewing around the edges. After that's attached, the straps can be sewn on. Pretty simple. Next up is the thigh straps. I used dark brown pleather for these and added a lot of slits on the sides because they are curved. Next, I simply pinned and top stitched the curved sides, then joined them together in the center and top stitched. Finally, I sewed them onto the pant leg. I did need some way to strap the whole leg covering onto my white pants, so I created a strap facing the opposite way to go through the pant loops that I added. I used Velcro for the closure, but snaps would work well here too. And for the finishing touches, I pressed in some eyelets and strung ribbon through them, sewed on some buttons and silver studs, and just hand sewed the straps down so they would be secure. With that, the hardest part of the costume is done. Here are some shots of the finished leg coverings. Because I wasn't filming when I made the green top, I'm going to demonstrate how to sew the metal ring loop with 2 scraps of fabric. For the front half of the green top, you will need 2 rectangles measured to the width and length of your bust, plus a 1/2 inch for seam allowance. You will need a metal loop. I had a hard time finding one, but I ended up finding this one in the jewelry section of Joann's marked as a bracelet. Now that I have my loop ready, I'm going to mark my seam allowance for this video. Pin the 2 rectangles of fabric together so they don't move around. Place your metal ring near the top edge and trace around it. Don't worry about it being exact, but do your best. I recommend tracing with tailor's chalk or disappearing ink on your real fabric. Once that's traced, the next step is sketching a seam allowance. You can just eyeball it, and it should be smaller than 1/2 inch. Once that's traced, sew in between the seam allowance and inner loop that you traced. Then cut out a circle shape around the seam. Finally, to help facilitate the curve, make snips all around the seam allowance. Here's what it looks like when you flip it right side out. Give that a quick press with your iron, then make sure that the metal ring still fits. The next step is sewing the top edge closed. It's a bit hard to see, but we need to turn the edges in on themselves to close it up and enclose any raw edges. To do this, flip the fabric wrong sides out again. We'll need to sew along the top edge where I marked the seam allowance, but most importantly, we need to leave a small opening for the metal ring to slip through on both sides. So stop right about where I'm marking the yellow pins. And here's what it looks like sewn with the openings on each side. Flip it all right side out again, and then push your metal ring through the openings that you left on each side. Once it's in there, all you have to do now is stitch around the outside of the loop. I recommend using a zipper foot, as that will allow you to stitch closer to the metal ring. My stitching was a little sloppy here, so try to make yours a bit neater. This is the hardest part of the green top, and once you have that done, you can just finish sewing the top together. And that's how you create the green ring top. Next are the belts and the details on the belts. First, I started with folding, pinning, and sewing the belts down. I made one wide belt around 43 millimeters wide and one thinner belt around 22.5 millimeters wide. Here's a test fit of the two different widths. Next, I took some Patico air dry clay and sculpting tools to mold the belt end on the thin belt. For the button, I created small clay shapes, then superglued them onto a button. For the belt buckle, I first created a template with paper. Next, I traced it out onto 2mm foam and cut out the base shape and trim. I connected the two pieces with barge contact cement, then sanded the edges with my rotary tool. Finally, I covered the buckle in black Warbler so that it would be nice and durable. The last step was painting those and the plastic belt loops I bought silver with folk art acrylic paint and sealing everything so it wouldn't chip. That concludes everything on the belts. She has a lot of details on them, but hopefully this helped break it down and make it nice and simple. And now the accessories. In order to get the bracelet to defy gravity, you'll need something sturdier than string, like wire. I used 18 gauge aluminum wire. All you have to do is string the beads onto the wire, then connect the two loops in this shape. You can either twist the wire together like I did, or add a proper jewelry closure. And there you go. For the gloves, I simply followed the pattern and instructions from the Yaya Han McCall's glove pattern M7397. For the silver bands, I sewed 3 tubes of metallic silver spandex by cutting out long rectangles, folding them in half and pinning, sewing along that edge, and then turning right side out. I connected them together at the seam with a piece of elastic so I wouldn't risk them shifting around and falling off my arm. And that concludes all of Emerald's arm accessories. Now I'm going to show you how I made my pouch and my gun holsters. Most of these steps are the same, but first I'll show you how to make the pouch. You can find a pouch pattern online. I sized mine to fit my cell phone. After cutting out the pieces, I sewed a brown pleather stripe to the front panel of the pouch. Next, I pinned the thin rectangle piece to the front. When you sew around the edges, be very careful as you get to the corners. By making slits in the fabric piece and carefully maneuvering the fabric, you can sew around the edge without creating any unsightly folds or wrinkles. It's a bit tough at first, but keep trying, you'll get the hang of it. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing, and if not, I'll link a more in-depth tutorial for the corners on the pouch. Here's what the corners will look like if you've done it correctly. Next, I hemmed the front flap. Then I attached belt loops to the back of the pouch. Finally, I sewed the back panel onto the rest of the pouch and hemmed the top. Now for the gun holsters, instead of sewing a belt channel, instead make 2 slits with an X-Acto knife for the belt to loop through. Zigzag stitch around the slits to make them secure. They're basically really large buttonholes. This is a super secure way to attach something to a belt because once it's in there, it does not move. My guns aren't light, but look how secure they are. To finish the pouches, I hand sewed buttons onto them. And that completes all the pouches. Alright, and that's the entire costume. Now let's check out how it turned out.